Hi, welcome to Making Sense of Complexity, featuring conversations with complexity science practitioners and philosophers. Our goal is to share insights on how to make sense of our complex and uncertain world. Today, our guest is Michaela Emch, a multi-talented communication and marketing specialist, translator, safari guide, keen naturalist, and biology enthusiast. In 2021, Michaela wrote the book, From Nature's Mouth, the Handbook for Bio-Infused Human Communication. Let's begin. Michaela, welcome to Making Sense of Complexity. How are you doing today?
Hi, George. I'm doing very well. Thanks very much.
I'm very excited about this, and I wanted to start. I asked my guests a question about kind of where they are and what the weather is like. So tell me where you're calling in from.
So I'm in the Swiss Alps, just at the point where Switzerland, Italy, and France meet. So through one window I can see Italy, the other window I can see France, sitting in the French-speaking part of Switzerland and in the mountains. And today is a bit rainy, but that's wonderful because I got my new garden planted in a biodiverse way. And so all the new plantations need to get their roots going. So that's wonderful for them.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I'm looking forward to seeing everything flower in a few days when the sun's going to be back.
Well, that's great. And so now give me an idea of how you got interested in complexity.
Well, I think complexity is a connects topic to a lot of things that always interested me. I think my first touch at complexity in a conscious way was at university, which is way too many years ago, in a class about epistemology. And that's when I got, familiar with this whole succession of scientific approaches. And that's the first time that somehow this whole question of threads of thoughts being linked together really appeared to me. Then again, I'm being a marketing and communication specialist, in that sense, always working with humans and with fluxes between humans. Systems of communication and of interaction have always been obviously complex, sometimes complicated, but very often complex and complicated. And when I took up my safari guiding career, the whole systemic approach of looking at nature where everything is related kind of echoed the whole complexity of ecosystems, be they human, technological, or natural. So complexity is everywhere. It's just most people don't realize that they're every day applying complexity.
Right. So you found it in the human world of communication and following up on that, and then your it sounds like your interest in and passion for nature got you exposed to a different way of thinking about it, and now you're trying to bridge between those two and put those together.
Yeah, the whole idea is to connect things that are not usually connected. I have a big passion for trying to reach extremes. We were playing in thought with Daniel, which you interviewed before, Daniel Friedman, about linking poetry and computers and randomness and ants, of course, and all kinds of religion and music, which are all happening to be complex systems and ways of making sense of the world around us. And yeah, I'm sure that if we try to bridge things that have not really been bridged, we will find new connections of interest.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a little bit about your book. It's From Nature's Mouth, the Handbook for Bio-Infused Human Communication. And it's something that you self-published, I gather. I know I have a copy of it, and I can't hold it up, though, because it's a digital version. So
I can hold it up.
Yeah. There we go. All right. There we go.
I have a paper version.
Yeah,
a
terrific.
few of them.
Terrific. So that seems like an effort where you're trying to bring together your interest in communication and what you've been observing in the natural world and bring it together and offer it. So tell us a little bit about about the book and the process of putting it together.
So what happened at the beginning of COVID was lots of time and a bit stuck at home. So I was looking for online courses that I could pursue. I was looking for the institution where I did my safari guide training, and they had an introductory course to biomimicry, of which I've never heard before, which sounds crazy now that you look back on it. And I took this course on biomimicry. There were 3 other courses. I took them all over a weekend. Some people binge watch series, and I binge watched biomimicry and got really deep into it, bought all the books I could find. And after a few weeks, I kind of noticed there had not been many things about human interaction and biomimicry that had been published. And so, well, I decided to do it since I'm a communication specialist and a new biomimicry practitioner in the formal sense. Why not link both? And I came up with answers to challenges to human communication in the 21st century as an applied method for biomimicry. Mm-hmm. And it took me a bit of time, and here it is. Fantastic.
Yeah. So I loved reading it, and you picked a particular story for the front part of it. You opened the book with the story of the hummingbird. And I wonder if you just give us the highlights and tell us what that story means to you and why you picked it.
So the story of the hummingbird is there is a big forest fire where hummingbirds live, so I guess South America, let's say. Big forest fire, all the animals run around crazy, taking shelter, pulling their hairs out for the mammals and their feathers out for the birds, not knowing what to do. And there is one small little hummingbird that goes to the river, picks up a little bit of water like a Canadair and drops it on the fire. And an angry armadillo turns to this hummingbird and says, "Well, you fool. How do you think this is going to help? The fire is huge. You have a small beak. This will never help." And the hummingbird turns around and says, "Well, at least I'm doing my part." And this is an analogy for how I feel about, all the broken systems in humanity and all the links that have been broken between humans and nature, within humans and between communities. And maybe this book can mend just a little bit or inspire people to pick up their own responsibility and try to extinguish this fire altogether.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting to me about that story that links in with complexity is that the act of that single hummingbird seems to be, it's isolated and all by itself, it's not having any impact. But in complex systems, it's the individual actions within a system of many, many, many individuals that ends up creating some really fantastic results. And
effects,
yeah, the analogy, Daniel talked a lot about ants, and a single ant left to itself will simply die. It has no efficacy in the world, but you put 1 million of them together and all of a sudden you have something really, really phenomenal.
Yeah, and I think also it talks to inspiration. I think we have been, trained in the last 30 years to see whatever is negative. If we singled out the positive actors and the positive initiatives of people or entities, it can be companies. I'm not stuck on what you call them, but there's lots of people that try to do good, and we should highlight them to inspire.
Yeah, so that's a communication challenge for our age. We tend to think of ourselves and our actions somewhat in isolation. We're self-oriented, and yet it's really in combination with everybody else that things can make a difference. And part of what you're trying to do is communicate that. That's a major communication challenge because it's so easy to hear negative stories, and media passes on negative stories. We hear those negative stories all the time, and it's easy to be discouraged because we don't hear all of those individual acts, positive acts that would help to give us the feeling that we're participating in trying to craft a solution with everybody else.
Yeah, there's two communication challenges at least. One is highlighting positive actions to inspire, to exemplify, but also to get these different initiatives to connect. It's like weaving a net of the future that exists in the present. People who are forward thinking or who have this passion for community and hope. I think there's lots of simmering initiatives that are under the radar, but if we connect all these people, all of a sudden it's a party. I mean, you're not alone anymore, and you can exchange resources, knowledge, and funds, I guess, and that can only help into the global scheme of things to renew our community.
Right, so that ties into another major topic in complexity science, and that's the issue of networks and building networks and the resilience of networks. And in the sense of human communication, that's really how we communicate with each other is one-to-one, one-to-many. There's this process that takes place, and then it gets repeated and repeated and repeated throughout the network, and eventually it reaches, you hope, all of the human beings on the planet, right?
Yeah. Hey, let's be ambitious. Let's try to reach a maximum of people.
Yeah, well, it's true that every human being is connected to every other human being. It may take a little while for things to filter through, and there are issues of how good that communication is by the time it gets to the end of the chain. But that opportunity is there to communicate because we're all connected.
Yeah, the connectedness, that's also very interesting in complexity, especially in computer science. We have lately very much been focusing on the nodes that connect different other nodes. I'm not a specialist, but maybe what is more interesting is the flux of information rather than the repository. It's like if you look at the human body, it's the circulation of blood that makes it happen. If blood stagnates somewhere, something's wrong. So you need to get, money maybe as well should be flowing and not be stocked in different organs, which is a sign of a sick organism.
Yeah, so that sounds like we're now talking about something that is both sociological, the flow of information, or economic, the flow of money, and in a living organism, the flow of blood, as an
nutrients,
example.
Water.
Yeah, as an example of some of the things that it seems to be the same concept of flow, but now it applies to very, very different networks at very, very different levels.
Maybe not.
Maybe not?
I don't know. Maybe we should, emulate through biomimicry the way that if we consider ourselves as a superorganism made up of cells, or, our gut biome, skin biome, and so on, and then maybe if you nest this, our communities, our societies, our companies, our groups are all superorganisms at different scales, and we could maybe learn something from nature on how it functions as a superorganism instead of thinking of the individual all the time.
Yeah, I think that's from the science of from network science as applied to biology and human institutions and economics. It really seems clear that there are parallels across all those different levels, and each level is different. So as you point out, each of the cells in our human body is a complex system, and those cells are working together in some way that it seems almost magical how these 100 billion cells could possibly work together, because they don't necessarily have somebody telling them what to do like you do in a hierarchical organization. They're just working together. That creates the human. with this immense capacity for cognition and language, and then so that human is also a complex organism, and that human is participating with so many other humans. So yeah, it makes sense to think of that as a complex organism. And then those institutions that we participate in all have relations with each other. They're operating at some level, and they're interacting with nature. And if you keep going, pretty soon you're, okay, now we're talking Gaia, right?
Right.
It's all
at
one.
least Gaia, if
At
you don't
least
go
Gaia.
to the universe.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so that's part of a way of imagining this linkage that we all have across those different networks, and I really like that. I wanted to ask you about the importance of biodiversity. That's a topic that comes up in your book, and so tell us what biodiversity is, why it's important, and how you see it.
Well, bio, or any diversity actually, is the possibility that, well, you're familiar with food chains that we learned in school. Now we're talking about food networks, which are way better representations of the way ecosystems function, or biomes function. So the less participants, diverse participants you have in a network, the more the network is at danger. Because it becomes fragile, because there's no redundancy and there's no feedback loops, multiple feedback loops, and resilience in case one of the participants in the network fails. Well, we see that with the power grid, for example. If you have a very centralized power grid and one of your nodes fails, then you have all of Texas having no more power during a snowstorm, for example. If you have redundancy and distribution and diversity, the whole system is way more resilient and thus much more prone to surviving a crisis from the outside. So it's very important, biodiversity, of course, and being in Switzerland, we're one of the worst countries for biodiversity. We lose the most species a year, I think, something like that, because of urbanization and concentration of population, and also we have very little parts of our territory that are protected, which I deplore. But you can see that if your garden, if you plant, do you know that the second largest crop in the world is lawn grass? I think.
I believe it. Yeah, I believe it.
It is sterile.
And it takes a lot of water.
It takes a lot of water, and it brings no nutrients. It depraves the soil. It's very bad for biodiversity. If we could reverse the idea of that, and plant local plants and favor biodiversity, which I'm doing practically in my garden right now, you also save species that are perfectly adapted to the place where you live, and thus strengthen again the biodiversity nets and recreate or restore to the maximum of your ability a network of resilience in nature that can come back from outside aggression.
Yeah, and I want to get back to that. You started with the discussion of the food web, and I think I just want to explore that a little bit, because it's an interesting way of thinking about it. In the food web, everybody eats something, right? And it's a circle, because it is, in a sense, a closed system. The biosphere is a closed system. Our life on Earth is a closed system. Yeah, there are some things that eat rocks, and that's helpful. It can, expand the cycle. Everything's reliant on water. So if you have a system that is where one animal, for example, only eats one other animal, who only eats one other animal, and this goes around in a circle, then you have essentially a circle that is very, very intolerant, fragile, intolerant to changes. So building or having a system that has multiple pathways, if one of the food sources declines, there are other options, and so the whole system can then respond to changes from the outside in a way that's resilient and continues to create that high level of biological function. So it's a good thing, right?
Well, diversity is always a good thing.
Yeah.
If you look at human endeavors, if you have diverse perspectives, if you have a diverse team, if you have diverse disciplines, diverse backgrounds, diverse demographics, and so on, you will start looking at things with a multitude of possibilities. If you only have white, male, straight, East Coast US educated people that went to the 3 same schools with the same teachers, the solution
By the way,
they will
Michaela,
come up with might.
me. You just named me, right?
I was looking at you.
White,
You're
male,
my
East Coast,
inspiration.
yeah, okay. Yeah, and
I'm not saying you're bad.
yeah.
I'm saying you're part of a diversity as well.
Yeah, I had a great interview with Sam Barton, and one of the points that he made is that complexity has ethical implications. And I think you've pointed to diversity as an example of something. It has very practical significance in an ecological sense, or in the sense of human institutions or communication. Very, very practical implications. But those implications point to diversity as having an ethical value. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Anything you do has an ethical value, if you look at it. It's just like anything you do has a political weight as well. Writing this book, I didn't think I was a political animal, even though I studied political science, but I didn't think it was a political act. But of course, as you write about perils between nature and human organization, and you end up with diversity being the best solution, it becomes a militant book for diversity, for the strength of the system, for sane competition that then turns into cooperation. So whatever you do is ethical, whatever you do is political, whatever you do is economical as well. So again, the links between the different spheres that we have been taught to think of in different, patches, everything is linked. If you follow your ethics, of course, you become political and economical and militant as well.
Yeah, so that's an interesting. I've been asking people about the threads from different branches of science. Complexity science is something that you can't put it in a box because everything is connected to everything else. So you're talking about physics of dynamic systems, but that interplays with the biological system, it interplays with the human system, and it also interplays with network theory, information theory, some things that we would think of as strictly sort of mathematical, but it all has connections across those many dimensions. And you're pointing out here that it's not just the technical science that is cross-cutting, but it has implications for ethics. It has implications for long-term survival. It has implications for how we build institutions.
Are you back? Oh, you froze for a few seconds. Sorry. I lost you.
We just keep going through these things. I think the system is collecting all that data, so we'll be able to put it together at the end. So the systems, so the ethics of that flows out of these findings in complexity science, biodiversity being a positive value for the functioning of the system, applied across to human institutions. And now when we get into the social sphere, as you point out, that potentially becomes a political issue, something to be potentially suggesting we need to change or transform the way institutions are structured if we're going to have institutions that contribute to thriving the way a diverse biological network contributes to thriving.
Absolutely. What is very interesting is, if you connect ethics and politics or ethics and economics, you end up with the next goal for me, and that would be actually the pursuit of what I did with this first book, is to write a book about bio-infused governance. Mm-hmm. How do societies in nature, be it cells, there's mm-hmm. societies kind of, cells, neurons, and ants, and meerkats, and wolves, and whatever, distribute power and make sure that their species survives within a thriving ecosystem. And it's quite interesting to see that, again, biodiversity, different solutions for different nested components are the answer. Ants function in a very decentralized, very flat, very simple way, self-governing, emergent. And then you have fairly elaborate social constructs such as the elephant societies or some apes. They already have like hierarchies and roles and defined dominances and so on and so forth. I think that is a very interesting field to find social innovation in nature. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's going to be biomimicry and not bio-copy-paste. Of course, you cannot say, oh, let's all go and live like wolves. But to be inspired by the juxtaposition of different ways of governing different types of entities, societies, companies, would be very interesting to see mm-hmm. what different types click together and what enter in conflict.
I can't wait to read that next book.
I have to write it first.
Yeah, you have to write it first. But let's go back to the book that you did write, because you take these learnings from the biological realm and apply them to human communication. So just tease that out a little bit. How does what happens in the biological world relate to humans communicating with each other?
Well, this was an exercise that I did, which was, kind of ask around me and brainstorm about what are the most important challenges that human communication faces now. So after a panel and brainstorming, I came up with 8 or 9 of these challenges, for which I then looked to nature to find solutions. So you abstract your challenge, you go to biology, you re-abstract the solution, and then you end up with like a precept. Let's like say, for example, one precept would be, let's be cautiously curious. Let's always keep our eyes open on about what's going on around us. Let's let in what is beneficial, leave out what isn't. And this is also a way how a cell membrane functions. It always senses its surrounding, and it lets in what is important for the cell to metabolize, and leaves out what is dangerous to it. So I came up with 13 of these precepts, and when I listed them without knowing, I actually could link them all to cell communication, which falls back to what we were saying before. Cells in our organism or tissues are working like a superorganism. So we're not the individual, the cells can be the individuals, and if we apply this cellular communication rules, then we can also, be the tissue for our societies.
Yeah. So let's go to that issue of curiosity then, that why is that beneficial for the cell to have that kind of exploratory aspect, that curious aspect?
Well, in order to know what's going on, I mean, intelligence is survival to a certain point. Intelligence in the sense of gathering information. If you don't know what's going on around you, you don't know how to react to it. You cannot prepare. You cannot evolve to survive. You cannot adapt. You cannot move if you have to move. I mean, we can see species now moving, migrating due to climate change. I live in the mountains. We have animals and plants that we didn't have here 20 years ago that are starting to rise in altitude. So, trees migrate too, very slowly, but they do. So if you're not attuned to your surroundings and you do not question if this is positive, negative, dangerous, propitious, or subject to collaboration, you're just waiting for something to happen to you, and you're passive. So there's a need to be active in searching for cues about evolution around you to be able to respond to that.
And to kind of extrapolate that, if you had a cell that was kind of closing off those areas of sensing and curiosity with the environment, if you had a cell that was closing those off, it's not going to be successful. It's likely not to survive.
Right.
So the parallel there now with human communication is, if human communication is open, curious, exploratory, freely flowing, working the way a healthy cell works in its environment, then that will contribute to a better flow of the information and communication in the human environment. And if you have a situation where that curiosity is lower, the ability to inquire is less, you've sort of closed off those areas of communication, that's going to end up with that human or that human community being more vulnerable, more limited, more fragile.
In danger, because it cannot feed itself anymore, right? It will not be able to choose what to do.
So it's interesting.
So censorship is dangerous in a certain way as well. Everything is linked again. It's not in the same chapter in my book, but if you try to shield off a community and say these people cannot talk or cannot have access to information, well, then sclerosis happens because this community cannot survive. Look at North Korea. I mean, these people live under perfusion of the outside world because they cannot adapt. They don't even know what is outside.
Yeah, now there are examples in biology when some retraction or protection is probably appropriate for survival, but as a permanent mode or structure, it's going to be self-defeating. The cell will, the cell may protect itself, or a spore, a bacteria may create a spore stage where it's going to be stable, it's going to continue, but that only makes a difference if it ultimately reaches an environment where it can then open up again.
If you have a spore that cannot sense that there is water for it to, get out of its dormancy, then it's going to stay a spore forever.
Yeah, that's a good example. So what I like about this is now we've gone from sort of the cell to the human issue of communication, and even then to the societal issue of responsiveness and resilience, and what it means to be in something that has that curiosity and explorative capacity that we see in healthy cells. Now it becomes a personal virtue, right? For people to have that quality, it becomes a personal virtue, and then at a societal level, it becomes an ethical principle that we would want to see and institutionalized, and then that means it's now a political issue, right?
Of course, and that's where you can come up with the whole story about open source, about openness of information, transparency, critique of your sources, cautiously curious, you know? I mean, don't just gullibly just absorb everything, otherwise your cell is in danger as well. Just, you know, check and see if that's really true, corroborate. Many aspects of how we treat information and knowledge are at stake here. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the issues you pointed out in your book is one of those challenges is the issue of credibility and trust, and talk about how a cell might how that might be looked at in terms of the cell that we were talking about earlier.
Well, the cell, I'm not a big biology specialist on cells, but I can try. I hope I'll be corrected if I'm wrong. But a cell will not react to the first lock and key. The first key, biological key to open it, has to be exactly the right one, first of all. So you have to have, you know, the code and the code, decode, encode, decode. That's one thing. And if it has adverse effects, it will then shut. That's the whole principle of the immune system, that will purge cheaters, liars, pretenders in the system that want to trick the cells to open up to them so they can be predated on. So yeah, it's about having these natural and proportional thought of responses adapted to the size of the inflammation. You don't need a cannon to like shoot down an ant, even though some people tend to do that.
Yeah.
And that then you damage many cells around instead of doing the surgical cuts you need.
Right, and I'm thinking now about COVID and what we've learned about. A lot of us have learned about biochemistry, and the way viruses work in ways that we never have before, and we've seen those images of the cell, which is covered with these spikes, and these spikes are certain types of, as you say, keys trying to unlock the cells. And because this is something that the body has never seen before, it doesn't have the defenses against this, and so the virus is kind of sneaking in with those spikes and opening up cells in ways that are unhealthy to the cells. So we want a system that doesn't automatically trust
Right.
what's coming in from a communication standpoint. Now, it doesn't automatically trust what's coming in, wants to know that this is credible and safe, and if something comes along that is not credible and safe, it has to be purged somehow from the system.
Or at least kept outside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So talk about the modern world of communication and what's going on there, and you know, draw some parallels to.
Oh, there's lots of parallels as you can find. I mean, you can find all types of propaganda. You can find all kinds of disinformation. You can find poisonous ideas for our society, or for even the people who read it and accept it, that are really spread like viruses, and that's the reverse story of the hummingbird. You know, lots of people think they're hummingbirds, but they're poisonous hummingbirds, because they're spreading one by one poison on, or they're fueling the fire with petroleum or whatever, thinking they do the right thing. And who are we to know that we're on the right side of it? I mean, only time will tell. If I'm sure I'm on the right side. Of course, you think you're on the right side, because you know we all look at life on our perspective, and my perspective is, okay, we would like the system to perpetuate itself and to better itself and to become more resilient, more resistant, more robust, more equal for all, more diverse, because this is our self-perpetuating characteristics that we want in an ecosystem. Some people will say, no, let's shut everything down. Let's, survival of the fittest, which is never what Darwin said. Darwin said survival of the best adapted, not the strongest. And that's always depends on the context.
Right,
so,
and that can be, that in an ecology, it can be extended to say the survival of those that cooperate the best and fill the niches appropriately and collaborate across
and perpetuate
the
ecosystem, not their own species, right?
Yeah. So it's, again, getting back to this analogy where we have a new world of open communication, social media, the internet. Anything can get out there, anything can be put out there by anybody. And we don't know the intention behind that, right? We don't know the intention, although a lot of it is driven by money, we know that, and some of it is driven by political power or political agendas. So the intention behind this information flow isn't always positive or beneficial or for our own interests. So we have to try and filter that, and it sounds like we need some kind of an immune system built, like the biotia, immune system that can be built to help police that process. Disinformation, for example, ways of curtailing disinformation, or putting labels on things and that sort of stuff. So that needs to be expanded.
The open information age is so young. The people who use it have not been, immunized yet. We're still very naive. We're like baby cells in this ecosystem, and we don't understand the tools. We don't recognize them fast enough. We clickbait. I mean, we have all our human biases that, I like this headline, so I'll just send it further, not even reading the article or checking the source. We all do that. I mean, even I do that, and I should not. I mean, if somebody should not, I shouldn't.
Yeah. So
but that this immune system will happen. It will create. And just to tell you, to go back to diversity, you see this from a global northwestern point of view, which is also where I sit. But if you travel to Africa or to Asia, very often your internet access is only on your phone, and it's very often only through Facebook. So you access the internet through Facebook or through WhatsApp or through whatever, and you don't even have the internet as the internet. So the internet is not searchable, it's just Facebook or social media that are searchable. Which means you cannot even corroborate what you're getting on your phone, which is, of course, subject to censorship from your government, from Facebook, from whoever you're following on Facebook. So, this tunnel vision, this segregation of content and siloing, again, through this idea of global community, but it's one of these mirrors that change shape when you look at it. You think you're in the global village, but actually you're just in one silo. And it's even more concerning for the global south, where internet access is additionally filtered before the access that we can have, for example.
So in that sense, we, more information flow is better, and less overt control and censorship of that information is better, because it will allow the individual actors to get access to a broader array of information, not simply more sources. But as you point out in your book, the biological examples we're using, the human cell and biological communities and ecology. I mean, that's 3.8 billion years of trial and error to get this right. Yeah. So we need, this is maybe a challenge to complexity science, is to say, okay, so what methods and processes the biological system has developed to handle these kinds of issues, communication, trustworthiness, how a cell responds to the input from the outside world. We need to figure out how to extrapolate some of those techniques into the world of how we're processing information and how how the web is working or how social media is working, and we need to try and do that on a pretty accelerated timetable because it's moving pretty fast.
As long as the purpose of the big media platforms on internet are to keep your attention span to sell you something, as long as it's driven by money, it's going to be very difficult for this immune system to create itself. Because it's basically disrupting this attention span duration, this available brain time or purchasing time that the social medias are craving. So yeah, I'm a little bit worried for the next times, but in the end the system will purge itself. It looks a little bit alarming now. In the end, we're trying to get our species to survive and our communities to survive. The planet's going to be fine, the internet's going to be fine, the ecosystem outside might change, but it will survive us. It's about our personal hygiene, our personal survival, that we really have to go and do whatever we can to at least open the discussion about it. I don't have the money to change Facebook. I can maybe have a couple ideas, and I'd love to be on their ethics board.
Well, this is a multifaceted, complex system that's going to require multifaceted change. And one of the things is we have this opportunity, you and I, to have a conversation about it, to get it out there. Others may hear it, others may follow. There are other people doing the same kind of thing. So we have a hope that there is a quiet, not very visible process, complex process at work among the billions of human beings on the face of the earth that will hopefully evolve a higher intelligence in terms of how to respond to this overload of information. Anyway, we can hope for that.
Hope dies last.
I want to change the conversation around a little bit and ask you something a little bit more, kind of more personal. It may seem off the boat, but part of what we're trying to do is how do complexity practitioners make sense of the world? And so part of this conversation is to ask you, do you have a religious background, something that some years ago was the basis for how you made sense of things, and how has that evolved as you've learned more about the complexity of the world?
Well, I was raised a Christian in a very distant Europe with religion. We kind of look at religion as a guide and not as a rule. So yeah, religion has been around me, but I never really found my thing with an organized religion, with a top-down approach. I thought that was kind of odd. When I was little, I wanted to become popus, which my mother told me was not possible. That's where I became a feminist. I decided that's really absolutely unjust for me not to be able to become a popus, because I think I do a great job, just because I'm not a man. So that's where I became a feminist. So religion, organized religion, has never really worked for me, because I've always had this link to nature and this very direct link to a personal responsibility, which is also something that is very Western. Do good to your direct environment and do good to your family, do good to your community. And we didn't really filter that through religion. But the more I learned about nature, the more I realized this dichotomy we had with, human race, human species, using nature for their own gain and mastering it the way it's described in the Bible. I always felt that was very odd, because hey, why is there a right for me to kill this spider because it's in my house? It was here before. And as kids you ask these questions, and then you usually fall in line and you're like, okay, this should not be here. So this is my territory. So
Yeah.
now I carry them out. It's like,
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Okay.
you're just in the wrong place, why kill it, which is very
good.
tree
Yeah.
hugger type of
Yeah. Well, that's good.
biological fun approach, I think.
That's great. You're morally more advanced than I am because I will kill spiders. But I do have one story that you might be interested in, and that is the word dominion, which is the one you said is in the Bible that becomes a very powerful word. The original Hebrew word, as I understand it, is radah. And that Hebrew word was translated to a dominion in the King James version of the Bible in English. The word radah means in ancient Hebrew, as I understand it, I've been told, it means something quite different. It's much more like the responsibility that a shepherd has over his flock.
Like a
Stewardship and engagement, involvement, or love that a shepherd has for his flock, that caring stewardship quality to it. Somehow that concept got completely lost in the King James translation, and you can kind of, there's a long cultural tradition of thousands of years
do
of how we
matter.
did that.
George, words do matter.
Yeah. So if we could regain that concept of radah, maybe there's and recast the way that story in Genesis unfolds, it would be a very different experience for people.
Yeah, the same way, that the book of, I read the Bible in French, but I mean, le fruit de la connaissance, that's the original sin is knowledge. And just get rid of it, That word, knowledge is sin, it's just impossible.
Yeah. And again, I think if you look, if you go back to the ancient way of seeing things, it's like the story of Babel is an example of when the knowledge or the money or when that becomes idolized and becomes the basis by which you structure your life, you're building an edifice. Well, there's an analogy with the Babel. They built the tower so high and God was angry and smote. And that was the end of that tower. Well, look at what we're doing now with the internet and the information age. And now everybody's in these self-reinforcing bubbles and silos. And pretty soon, we're not going to be able to talk to each other. Right,
even though we're in every language.
Yeah. So there's some messages from some of those. Anyway, I didn't want to digress, but it's clear that some of what you've been learning about in the biomimicry exploration is reshaping how you think this makes sense. So do you want to follow up that thought in terms of making sense of
I like your idea of radah, if this is like stewardship or community or interaction. I think that is also, again, the hummingbird. It's a wonderful, because we're going to close with the same thing we opened with, which I like as a storyteller. The animals or the species are kind of stewards of their own little piece of land or soil, but they're stewards together. They cannot be stewards each on their own, because it's the system that functions. Their own species is so vulnerable if you take the system away. The long-term cycles, nutrient cycles, energy cycles, water cycles of our planet, and this constant slight instability that keeps our system together, that keeps evolution going, that keeps adaptation going, and climate change, natural climate change, the continents, and so on and so forth. These very slow evolutions need to be here for ecosystems to thrive and to evolve. Otherwise, we'd be still in the primal soup, right? If there was no outside stimulus for us. So each has to be the steward of themselves, of their community, of their society, of their link to nature, of themselves inside as well. But we can only be stewards of the world we're part of together.
Mm-hmm. So we are individuals, but we are interconnected and co-dependent, if you want to use that word.
And co-responsible.
Co-responsible. And those links of connections extend to not just ourselves, our family, our community, but it's linked to the natural world. And the natural world is linked globally. The human world is linked globally. So we are linked together in a global sense. And that is, I don't want to paraphrase, I'm paraphrasing, but that's how you are making sense of this process, that we all have that joint responsibility. We're all interconnected. We're all part of this greater whole.
From the nano to the macro to the extremely big, all these concentric and nested components. We are one tissue of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That sounds very much like a creation story.
It is a great cosmogony.
Yeah. So maybe we need more of those narratives to kind of get people
to make sense of things.
Yeah, to make sense of things. Yeah, that's great. So we're at the end here. I have one question I want to close on, and that is if you could share, if you have any, an experience that you feel was really important in your life, don't necessarily have a way of explaining it, or maybe it's a little mystical, or something that you'd call sort of transcendent.
One experience that always amazes me to the highest extent, and I had that since I was like maybe 4 years old, is we used to go and catch tadpoles. And that transformation of tadpoles into frogs, and the frogs come back to lay eggs in the same place, and you start the cycle again, and the thing first lives in water, and then it lives in air, and then it's got all these crazy adaptations. It's carnivorous, and then it's not, and it's the most crazy animal to study is all these frogs, and the fact that they're great biomarkers, that they live in different environments, in different states of matter, and they're very good vigils to tell us when an ecosystem is failing. They're the first ones to go because they're very sensitive. And I think, just that transformation, and we even have different names for the same animal. The egg, the tadpole, the frog, even if it's the same individual. So I think that's kind of mystical. It's like, you're a baby, you're a child, you're an adolescent, you're an adult, and then you pass on your genes and the cycle starts again. I think that's a very mystical thing to look at time lapses. Don't go and catch tadpoles. They need to be in the wild, but it's
that sense of wonder and awe is part of what you feel as an inspiration for what you do. Great. That's wonderful. Michaela, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much. And
thanks for having me, George.
Yeah. Well, we're making sense of complexity.
We're trying.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Making Sense of Complexity. Next episode, I will be joined by Michael Garfield, the host of the Santa Fe Institute's Complexity podcast. Some 84 episodes featuring conversations with some of the world's smartest and most interesting complexity scientists. Michael is also an artist, musician, writer, editor, organizer, and cultural change agent. In the meantime, please explore the websites of our collaborators, Complexity Weekend, Planksip, and Talk of Today, and join the conversation on our social media outlets or on spiralinquiry.org. Stay well and have a great week.